And we are live. Hello everybody and welcome to my kitchen. My name is Linda Mokko. I'm in Finland and I'm super curious. And so I like to invite people to have conversations about their deeply held beliefs using something called Street Epistemology. And today my guest is Dean Meadows from North Carolina, and we have met twice previously. This is our third topic, or actually we've spoken 3 times before, but this is our third topic. The first time we spoke about Dean's definition of God. The second time it was, the topic was, can we be good without God? And today we will be the topic will be the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so welcome, Dean. Welcome to my kitchen. How are you doing today?
Hey, what's going on? You have a lovely kitchen, by the way. Once again, always happy to be on and have these interesting and really cool conversations.
Great, and I love to have you. So thank you for coming back and for being so generous with your time. I just had the opportunity to meet your family briefly, and they are just lovely.
Oh,
and,
I know that teared up, and I got more than I deserve.
Oh, yeah. So thank you for being here with me today. And the belief that we're going to investigate today, we chose this topic. Is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Is that what you would like to look at?
Yeah, no doubt. I think it's definitely not just one important topic of many, but I think for at least those of us who hold to the Christian worldview, it's the topic.
Good. Well, how confident would you be on a scale from 1 to 100 that this belief is true?
Yeah. Well, I'd say maybe I'd put it this way. I'm as confident in the resurrection as a historical event as I would be in the United States winning the Revolutionary War against Britain. I guess that's how confident I would be. So if I put it on maybe your scale, I'd say definitely upper 90s as far as confidence level.
Upper 90s. Oh yeah, and I forgot to describe the scale if somebody watching isn't familiar with it. So 1 would be all doubt. I'm not sure. I'm not confident this is true at all. And 100 is no doubt, 100% true. I'm certain of it. Yeah, completely, no questions. And you're saying upper 90s. So that's pretty sure, pretty certain.
Pretty sure, yeah. I'll go with that.
And Dean, what is your main reason for believing, for having that high level of certainty in this issue?
Well, I think primarily I think that the Gospels are historical documents. Number 1. Number 2, I think the nature of the event with regards to the experience that the disciples had in seeing Jesus, I guess maybe the fancy term for it would be the polymodal nature of that experience, where it's not just everybody individually one at a time saying, oh, well, I saw Jesus on the lake, I saw Jesus on the lake, I saw Jesus on the lake, I saw Jesus on the lake. But it's the different interactions that are recorded in the Gospels, where you have Jesus, walking down the street. You've got Jesus eating. You've got Jesus showing up when there are some disciples that, or I believe Thomas isn't there. And so this is different than just something like a brief momentary hallucination. So those are at least 2 reasons why, I think that it's a historical event.
Yeah. And are the nature of the events that you described, aren't they also documented in the Gospels, in the Bible?
Yeah, they are. What I've described are in the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
All right. And how have you determined that the Bible is reliable, is a historical document?
Yeah. No, I think that that's a really good question. And there are several ways that you can show that a document is historical. So, for instance, there's multiple attestation, which is a form of verifying something is historical. So, if you have multiple sources that verify a specific event in history, then it's more likely than not that that's a historical event, right? So, there's internal or not internal, but multiple attestation as if you look at the Gospels, not as necessarily divinely inspired books, but if you just take them and say, all right, I'm going to look at these and investigate these things.
You broke up there
attestation there, but there's all
the internet connection just failed there.
Oh, sorry.
You broke up after you said that. Good question. So maybe I should ask you to.
I can run it back if you want me to, and then you can edit it out later if you want.
Sure.
So one of the criteria,
like how documents are considered historical, like the criteria.
Yeah, that was what it was about. Criteria is if a specific event is attested by multiple witnesses in history. So in the same way in which someone would investigate a bank robbery, one of the things that they would do is they would tell the story that will corroborate the details of the story.
All right, you broke up there just a little bit, so I'll fill in what I think it was, and then you can tell me if I was right or not.
Okay.
All right. If there was an investigation, a detective would then look at the evidence, and he would.
Yeah. He would ask multiple witnesses.
All right.
He would see if anybody was around that crime scene or people in the local area and ask, okay, well, hey, did this event, this is what we're investigating. Do you know anything about that? What took place? And what he would do is he would talk to those people and ask, okay, this is this person's story. Here's this person's story. Here's this person's story. Do they all attest that, yeah, I heard this, I saw that, this is what took place, and get kind of the core structure of, okay, well, then this event happened. So
okay, that also, so are these events then documented in more than the Gospels or more than the Bible? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So, for instance, there are aspects of the gospel narrative with regards to Jesus' life that are mutually attested, not just within the documents of the New Testament, but also externally. So, for instance, Tacitus, who's a Roman historian, notes that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. And there are also other authors that note, or I think it's Tacitus as well. It's either Tacitus or Pliny the Younger that notes that Christians also died for their belief that Jesus had rose from the dead. And so when you put both of those things together, you can kind of construct and see the similarities between the external evidence by Tacitus and other Roman historians and what's written in the Gospels. So, yeah.
All right. And I can understand how that could give like a reason to believe it's possible that Jesus rose from the dead. But how did you get to such a high level of confidence? And I have well, that's kind of like putting two questions there, if you don't mind. I'm trying to lead up to what I'm getting at. Is can these documents be mistaken? Can they include any kind of errors or?
Yeah. So that's what's and that's part of the reason why we do the historical investigation and our personal investigation to see. If these documents are reliable. So in saying, is it possible that they're mistaken? Sure, it's possible that they're mistaken as historical documents. But I think that's also why you check for things like kind of what we've talked about. Are there mutually attested things inside and outside of the Gospels? Is there anything within the writing, maybe the criteria of embarrassment that comes into play? And the other thing that you need to check for is, okay, well, how close are the original documents to the actual event, right?
Okay, but isn't all of that kind of like documented in the Bible? So if we would like group that all up into the Bible, what if that historical document could be shown to be unreliable, as in it might, or does it have inaccuracies in it, do you think?
Well, looking at the New Testament as far as the construction of the resurrection, if we simply look at it as a piece of history, just like any other historical document, I don't necessarily know if they're minor details that are different. I don't necessarily know that means that it's a all-out contradiction, but different details doesn't automatically mean unreliable document, right? So, for instance, if we were looking at a crime scene or whatnot, and you started to interview witnesses, and one witness said, well, I saw a person, roll into the bank, from my right. And then you ask somebody else, well, I saw this person come in, from my left. Well, that's a difference, but that's not necessarily a contradiction, because they could have been coming from that person's right, person's left, depending on where that person was situated with regards to the crime scene. Does that make sense? So I don't think that the New Testament, I think there are differences, but I don't think that they're resurrection.
You broke up just as you were saying that there are differences in something.
Yeah, I don't think that there are substantial differences or substantial differences that would negate the historical core facts with regards to the resurrection. There might be one gospel that says there were 2 women. There might be another gospel that says that there are 4 women. And I'm just going hypothetically. I don't specifically know off the top of my head. There might be another gospel that says that there were 15 women. But the core historical facts surrounding that is that there were women at the tomb, right? Furthermore, I think it's plausible that all of these women were at the tomb. There's some significant.
Oh no, you're breaking up again. After you said that it's possible that all the women were at the tomb, then I didn't hear anything.
Okay, sorry. So one of the points that we need to look at whenever we investigate any work in antiquity or any claim in antiquity with regards to reliability of a document would be, how close are these documents to the recording of the event and the actual event, right? So if Jesus dies in 30 to 33 AD, how close are the originals to that actual event? Or how close is maybe a creed that might be recorded in the New Testament close to that actual event? Because that gives us kind of a time frame.
But does that can they still be like mistaken? I'm kind of like thinking, could somebody document something happening in real time and still get some facts wrong about it? Is that like possible also for these ancient documents, or this one in particular that has convinced you?
No, I think that it's certainly, I mean, when it comes to, history and maybe even other aspects of life, I think anything is possible. But do I think that the gospel authors got it wrong? No, I don't think that they did, but they could. But once again, I'll go back to what I said previously. I think that's why you do the historical investigation and look and see if they're reliable.
And how did you determine that they were? Like, what was what convinced you that they were reliable, that they cannot be, or is it so that they cannot have mistakes on this particular account of the resurrection of Jesus?
Yeah, no, I think part of that I hope I'm not speaking in circles, but I think part of that has kind of been, I've mentioned at least one pillar, and I don't think it's one specific thing. I think it's a cumulative case that takes place. So one would be some of the criteria of mutual attestation, criteria of embarrassment, criteria of background and geography. Those things are consistent throughout the Gospels. But also, I believe that the documents of the Gospels are relatively recording the event shortly after the event occurs. And therefore, they're more likely than not being recorded at a short date in which legend and myth don't have the opportunity to creep in, because as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians, there are still witnesses there. And even in the time of these recordings, the disciples are still around to kind of proof check some of those things. So I think, and even when you look at the internal evidence of the New Testament, none of these Gospels, sorry, I think I'm about to sneeze. Sorry. None of these Gospels record, say, for instance, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, which is a huge moment in history for the Jewish people. That would be like recording the events of what happened in the year 2001, and then leaving out the attacks on the World Trade Center in 9/11, right? That's how big of an event the destruction of the temple was in AD 70, because after that, you don't have temple worship ever again in the course of Jewish history. So the fact that they leave these out seems to indicate that these were written before AD 70. One more piece, and then I'll let you respond. Furthermore, in Luke's gospel, or in Luke's writings, he doesn't record the death of Peter. He doesn't record the death of Paul. He doesn't record the death of James. And so it's considered, at least in a conservative section, and even by some other sources outside of the conservative wing of Christianity, these guys died 65 and 62. So the fact that Luke doesn't record their death seems to indicate that those deaths didn't happen at that time, which means that writing is prior to those time markers. So
right. So that's still, those are criteria that you have found that support.
Those are just reasons why I think the documents are reliable historically.
Historically. I guess what I really don't get, honestly don't get there, is how does, even though the document is considered to be historically, I guess, written at close to the events and all that, is it possible that the people who have written these documents have gotten some of the accounts misinterpreted them, maybe embellished a bit, maybe had a motive to write things to have a profound impact, to motivate people to do things? Do you know what I mean? How do historians go yes, even this I guess supernatural event, something that we haven't observed, of a person dying and then coming back to life. Oops, sorry, I'm breaking up too. Sorry about that. Right, so yeah, that's something of that nature. A person or this.
So you're
dying and then coming back from.
Yeah, run that back again. I'm sorry, you broke up, and it's my internet. I'm sorry about that. You said the last thing I caught was, how do we know that they weren't mistaken, that they didn't write something to motivate?
The intent of the writing of these texts. How have historians, or yourself, because I'm asking about your belief, have you determined that they got it right? They got that it correlates with what actually happened, especially an event so profound as this one.
So I personally think that one of the ways that we can look at any historical document and see, okay, well, how honest is the author going to be, is oftentimes, even in our own lives, when we want to protect somebody or we want to protect ourselves, we won't include some embarrassing material about what's going on. We'll negate kind of the embarrassing stuff, and we'll embellish all of the great things that have taken place or whatnot. And so one of the interesting things that you look at when you see the gospel narratives is that they include a lot of embarrassing material, not just about the gospel, about the disciples, not just about Jesus even, but also some cultural embarrassments that would definitely hinder their case. And so one of those things would be there are multiple times in the Gospels where Jesus teaches something, the disciples don't get it, and Jesus says something to the effect, "Do you not understand these things?" Or when Peter supposedly walks out on the water, right, and he doubts, or he's there and he goes, "You of little faith," or the fact that the Gospels record Peter, who in one moment is saying, "Jesus, I'm ready to die for you." Essentially, I'm paraphrasing. And then in the next moment, he is denying Jesus, or the fact that the disciples disperse and scatter at the point which Jesus is arrested. Those instances, or the fact that Jesus is told by the religious elites of his time that he does stuff by
Can
the
I
power
ask for
of...
clarification just now? Because
Yeah.
all of that is in the Bible.
Yeah.
Is it so? Are you saying that it's so well written that it cannot be erring in any way?
No, that's not the claim that I'm responding to. You asked me, how do I know, or why do I believe that these documents are historically reliable, and that that they didn't kind of do this to make it up, or do this to religiously motivate people, or that they didn't get it wrong. And my response is, one of the ways that I believe that we can know that they didn't kind of manipulate the text and that they told the truth was because they include these embarrassing facts about themselves, about Jesus, and even include something with specific reference to the resurrection.
But that's just so written in the Bible. What if they were so clever? They were like, "We're going to write this in a way," and Dean's going to read it and he's going to go, "So this must be true because we are not like describing all the characters with great character." Is that a possibility? Yeah. Or how did you rule out that possibility?
Well, once again, I think anything is possible, but with regards to of the Gospels, I don't necessarily know that the evidence would prove that. I think you'd have to have some serious proof to show that they kind of got together and said, "Hey, let's write this in a way that we can kind of manipulate, or not manipulate, but encourage people to act in a certain way." I mean, one of the things that's unique about the Gospels is in that time frame, a woman.
Oh, you're breaking up on woman.
Good was not. Okay. Sorry, broke up. That
just broke a little bit. Woman, just before I got you in time now. Just back up a little bit.
So like a woman's testimony in that day and age would not hold up in the court of law. So the fact that the Gospels record women finding the tomb empty would be an article of embarrassment that doesn't help their case, but actually hinders their case given the cultural norm of women. And so they stick with it regardless, despite the cultural prejudice of the time towards women's testimony. So it's more likely in some of the writings that you see, I think Plutarch would be a good source, that oftentimes what one for the person, they will omit some very embarrassing material, and some of that embarrassing material is left in the Gospels. That's why I think it's historically reliable.
All right, you were breaking up just a little bit, but you were saying about how it contains the embarrassing material, and so therefore it is reliable.
Yeah.
I guess my next question would be, what I'm wondering about is that if how would you know if you were mistaken? Like, how would you identify what kind of I guess evidence, or what could possibly show you that you would be incorrect in this determination?
So there are a couple things specifically within the New Testament that I would say would count as being that would lower my confidence in the reliability of the Testament. So, for instance, if you have some cultural things and geographical things that are mistaken. So, for instance, if they talk about Jesus met with the disciples, and after they were done, they went and sent Western Union to Jesus's mom. Well, Western Union wasn't even around then. Or if they said something to, and I'm exaggerating to prove a point.
Yeah.
But if they said something like, and Jesus went over to New York City and wore cowboy boots and watched a John Wayne movie, right? Something that is that just doesn't coincide with the time frame or the culture, or makes significant geographical blunders. I think that would be something that could potentially lower my confidence. So if you're writing about Jesus and they say, well, Jesus was here, in Galilee, and in Galilee there was located the temple of the Jews, right?
Okay.
Well, historically speaking, looking outside of the Bible, we know that the temple of the Jews was located in Jerusalem, not Galilee.
Okay.
Right?
I think I got that point.
Yeah.
I think I got that point.
Or if they.
What about physical inaccuracies? Because you're talking about geological accuracies, and you're comparing what we know about the world at that time, and its geography and temples and cities not yet born and so on. What about what we know about physics and how we have not yet observed a person coming back from the dead? Would that also suffice as something that would maybe lower your confidence?
I think you would have to look. I think you have to look at the nature of the resurrection accounts, and ask the question, okay, given what's been written, what is the most probable explanation for a couple of things? One, the empty tomb, and two, the reason why the disciples, at least they believed they had an experience of the risen Jesus and were willing to die for that.
Right.
So I think whatever hypothesis we want to present with regards to the resurrection, it has to not only consider the empty tomb, but it also has to account for the change in the disciples' demeanor and the spread of and the rise of Christianity. So any hypothesis we put forward has to account for those three things. And making a historical claim about the resurrection would be I don't think it's any different than making a historical claim about whether or not Caesar crossed the Rubicon, or some other historical event that took place that could be considered highly unlikely.
Except here we're also talking about suspending what we know about, like, the physical, like how physics works. Like, this introduces something supernatural, doesn't it?
No, I understand that, but
Oh, it broke up now completely after I asked you if it does
Sorry.
imply something supernatural occurring.
You froze.
No.
And my point is, the way in which you investigate history is the way in which you investigate history. Meaning, if we're going to take the historical criteria for one event in history, it makes sense to apply the same criteria for another event in history, regardless of the claim, right? There are historical claims of people doing their historical claims, like with Plutarch with regards to Romulus, for instance. Well, we can investigate Plutarch with regards to Romulus and ask the question, all right, what's Romulus
You're breaking up again. We could ask the question of, and then it.
Yeah, sorry. So when we look at things like the biography of Romulus or the existence of Romulus, historically speaking, we would apply the same criteria to Romulus as we would, say, the resurrection, and say, all right, is there any evidence that it took place? And so I think there's substantial evidence, sufficient evidence for the resurrection, and there's no, or little, I'll go with little just to be genuine to the potential Romulus believers out there. Little evidence that Romulus ever existed. So yeah, I think that the way in which you do history in one area is the way that you would do history for another area, regardless of the claim.
Okay. I think I'm going to round up my questions now because I have to go and do my evening rounds in 15 minutes. And I do want to give you a chance if you have any questions for me or questions about my questions. And
no, I think it's fine. There's just one other thing that I'd like to kind of get in there as far as biblical reliability. So another way in which we can look and note the reliability of the New Testament comes from what I call historical coincidences. Other people might call them undesigned coincidences. And so it's where there are details from one account of a piece of history that are supplemented by another piece of historical writing that's independent of the others. So most people would say that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the synoptic gospels, right? That they share sources. Now, I have some questions about that, but on average, most New Testament scholars would say that these all share a source or multiple sources. Whereas John is not associated with these three. So John is separate and apart from these three. And so what's interesting here is a primary example of an undesigned or historical coincidence is that in John chapter 2, verse 18 and 20, he notes, he talks about, Jesus says that he will destroy the temple, his body, and he will raise it again in 3 days. Now, in Mark 14, 55 through 59, Mark records the scene about Jesus before the Sanhedrin. And I'm trying to go quick because I know you got rounds to do. And he notes that the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus, that they could put him to death. And it says that many testified falsely against him, and their statements didn't agree. And then some stood up and said that they gave false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy the temple made with human hands. In 3 days we'll build another one not made with hands. Yet even their testimony didn't agree. Now, notice that when we find this and we compare these passages, that the false witnesses described by Mark distort what Jesus said. But the question is, how do we know what Jesus said in Mark? We don't know what Jesus said in Mark with regards to the temple. Only when we look at the Gospel of John do we find exactly what Jesus supposedly said about the temple. And so you have this instance where you fill in the question about, hey, what did Jesus say in, with regards to Mark, by looking at the Gospel of John. And so those are what I call historical coincidences that John wouldn't have picked up on because he's separate and apart from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Does that make sense?
It makes, I guess, sense what you're describing. To me, it's still like it's all in the Bible. They're all documented in the Bible.
But I'm taking those
and I haven't found like good reason to believe that it's authored by other than humans. And I know from experience and from what I've read about people that we can get things wrong. We can be mistaken. That I think that just that the possibility exists that people might have believed this and wanted to write about it and might have misinterpreted an experience or something. That is possible, kind of like doesn't allow me to have a high confidence that would be absolutely true, or like even in the high 90s. I would have to reserve a lot of pause before I would accept it.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question? I know
sure.
you've got to go.
I've got 10 minutes more, so I'm good for 10 minutes.
So my question would be then, so with regards to history, how do you personally figure out what is historical and what isn't historical? Well,
for me personally, I have to say I do trust historians quite a bit. They're the people who have studied how to study history, especially ancient history. So I do have a lot of trust in the kind of the process of how historians work. I also have understood that it's about probabilities and likelihoods. And I have understood that with the question of the Bible that there is still some question as to whether everything that's written there is in fact true. That it's kind of like, how can we really know to a point where we're certain about, especially supernatural events occurring? My skepticism, of course, is like, well, that's like never been observed. So why would I just take it on a document that actually happened? No matter how great that document would be written, if it's written by people, it can be incorrect, is what I'm thinking. But I could be wrong.
I guess my question would be, couldn't we say that about multiple documents of history outside the Bible? That I know that Plutarch wrote this, and I know that Tacitus wrote this, and I know that Josephus wrote this, but after all, they're humans and they could have gotten it wrong, and I just don't necessarily know that I see a lot of reason why I would, trust Tacitus no matter how great, his document might have been written, or how good his document might have been written. It seems to me that if we're, and I'm not making the argument for the resurrection on like the divine revelation claim. I'm saying that these are sources that are based off of people who were near the event and wrote in a short time afterwards. So in the same way that Tacitus was, in the same way that Josephus was, in the same way that some early church fathers record some events within the church. So here's my, and so I guess my question is, how do you get, I guess my question would be then, if you apply that standard to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, do you also apply that standard to Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger, other historians of antiquity?
Tassa who? Like the honest answer is that I'm not. have not studied these historians. Like I said, I trust that the historians of our time and the educators that came together and decided what would be taught in school, that these are, you know, likely, and they can also be kind of wrong. That like I cannot remember in history class any history teacher telling me that these that the Gospels are real and historically true. That is why I still remain skeptical. So,
well, we could go on another 20 minutes about why I think that might be the case, and that's a totally different conversation. So, I guess I have two final questions for you.
Okay.
And then you gotta get out of here to do your rounds. One, is it okay if we kind of stay on this subject and do another live stream at a later time where we might have more time to discuss this?
Oh, sure. I think this was really interesting, and yeah, I always like coming back to the same topics and revisiting, especially if you want to. Then yeah, I'm game.
And in that live stream, when we come back to it, we can continue to talk about the reliability of the New Testament, but maybe just look at some facts that the majority of historians would agree on, whether they're conservative, whether they're liberal, whether they're skeptical, whether they're religious. Would that be okay?
Sure. I think that's really interesting, actually. And one of questions I do have, so maybe I can get it in there as well, like does and I would like to look in on this, that does the religious belief of the historian affect their acceptance of the resurrection of Jesus as fact, as something that actually happened.
Gotcha.
That I think is really interesting about, you know, possible biases and things like that interest me.
Yeah, no doubt. So, but that's really all that I have until our next live stream.
Okay, thank you, Dean, so much for joining me again.
Sorry, I lied. I have one more question.
Okay.
Will you send this to me like we've done in the past?
Oh yeah.
So that I can put it up.
Absolutely, and you can use it freely as you see fit.
Okay.
And yeah, so thank you so much again for joining me. It really gives me great practice in doing street epistemology, in listening to how you believe what you believe, which I find really, really interesting. So thank you for being so generous with your time and
it's always a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. You're such a nice guy.
All right, thanks, Linda.
Have a nice night and take care, and catch you next time.
Take care. All right.
Bye.
Bye.
And to all my viewers, thank you for joining me this time, and please leave comments in the comment section. Any feedback you might have, it can be positive, it can be constructive, things that I can improve on, maybe some questions that I missed, opportunities I missed, and yeah, and if you have any requests for what you would like to see me do here on my channel, you can always put such you know, stuff in the comment section. Yeah, I think this was a kind of good one today. Kind of okay. Feeling pretty good. So everybody, oh yeah, and I also remember to subscribe and to like if you liked it. And I also wrote my Twitter handle this time in the description if you want to direct message me with suggestions, if you want to come talk on my show, feel free to do that. And have a great day, everybody, and catch you next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye.